Anthony Morris III was one of the most recognizable and influential faces of the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses. Appointed in 2005, he was known for his inflammatory speeches, rigid posture, and absolute loyalty to the organization. For millions of believers, he represented the voice of ultimate spiritual authority within the Watchtower, a man who dictated what was truth, morality, and obedience. But in February 2023, something unexpected happened. The official website of Jehovah's Witnesses announced, in a single discreet line, that Brother Anthony Morris III no longer serves as a member of the governing body. No explanation. No note of gratitude. No public farewell. Just silence. His name was erased from the website, and all his appearances and videos began to disappear from official platforms. This sudden and enigmatic departure sparked a storm of speculation among former members and observers. After all, what could lead such a powerful man within the organization to be removed so coldly? After analyzing available information and comments from those who followed the case, 3 possible reasons seem to stand out. Before diving into these theories, it's essential to understand who Anthony Morris III truly was within the Watchtower structure. He wasn't just another member of the governing body. He was a figure who embodied the organization's most conservative and uncompromising wing. His speeches were legendary among witnesses, not for their warmth or encouragement, but for their harshness and unwavering demands for obedience. He was the man who famously condemned tight pants on men as homosexual propaganda, who spoke with fury about apostates deserving destruction, who painted vivid pictures of Armageddon's violence with an almost gleeful certainty. To many faithful witnesses, he was a spiritual warrior. To critics and former members, he was the face of authoritarian control. Morris's background added to his mystique within the organization. He was a Vietnam War veteran who claimed to have served with distinction, a narrative that the Watchtower used to bolster his credibility as someone who had seen the darkness of this world and chosen God's path. His military past was frequently referenced in his talks, positioning him as a man who understood discipline, sacrifice, and the reality of spiritual warfare. The organization presented him as someone who had traded one uniform for another, now fighting for Jehovah rather than for worldly governments. His rise through the Watchtower hierarchy was steady and seemingly inevitable. Before his appointment to the governing body, Morris had served as a circuit overseer and had built a reputation as someone who enforced rules without mercy or compromise. Stories circulated among congregations about his visits, where elders would tremble at his scrutiny and members would be counseled for the smallest infractions. He was not a man who believed in gray areas. Everything was black and white, right and wrong, obedient or rebellious. When he joined the governing body in 2005, many saw it as the natural culmination of his career. Here was a man who would never compromise the organization's standards, never soften its message, never allow worldly thinking to infiltrate God's clean organization. For nearly 2 decades, he delivered on that expectation. His broadcasting appearances became must-watch events for faithful witnesses, who would nod along as he condemned everything from higher education to holidays to any form of entertainment that didn't explicitly glorify Jehovah. He was particularly obsessed with clothing, constantly monitoring what brothers and sisters wore, issuing stern warnings about modesty, professional appearance, and the dangers of following worldly fashion trends. But beneath this facade of unwavering strength, cracks were beginning to show. Those who paid close attention noticed patterns that didn't align with the image of spiritual perfection the governing body projected. And then, without warning, he was gone. The announcement was so brief, so devoid of the usual Watchtower language of appreciation and blessing, that it immediately raised red flags. The organization that typically celebrates its leaders with elaborate tributes had reduced Morris's departure to a single sentence. No explanation of health issues. No mention of retirement or reassignment. No acknowledgement of his nearly 18 years of service at the highest level. Just an abrupt, cold statement that he was no longer serving. The silence that followed was deafening. No follow-up announcement. No letters to congregations explaining the change. No video tribute or farewell message. It was as if Anthony Morris III had never existed. His videos were scrubbed from the website, his face removed from group photos of the governing body, his name erased from current literature. For an organization that claims divine guidance and unity among its leadership, this sudden erasure was shocking and unprecedented. 1. Problems of conduct and alcohol abuse. The first and most widely discussed reason involves alleged conduct problems related to alcohol. This theory gained significant traction after a video surfaced showing Morris purchasing large quantities of alcoholic beverages at a liquor store. The video, which quickly circulated among ex-witness communities and online forums, showed him filling a shopping cart with bottles of expensive whiskey on a Sunday morning. The footage was unmistakable, captured by someone who recognized him and quietly documented the purchase. For many who saw it, the image was jarring. Here was a man who had spent decades preaching about moderation, self-control, and the dangers of worldly indulgences, loading his cart with premium spirits that would cost the average witness family a week's worth of groceries. The Watchtower organization has always maintained a complicated relationship with alcohol. While not outright forbidden like in some religions, drinking is heavily regulated through unwritten rules and social pressure. Witnesses are constantly reminded to drink in moderation, to never appear intoxicated, to avoid situations where alcohol might lead to stumbling others. Elders are held to even stricter standards, with the expectation that they model perfect self-control in all areas of life. And governing body members, as the ultimate spiritual authority, are supposed to be beyond reproach, living examples of Christian perfection that all witnesses should aspire to emulate. The video raised immediate questions. Why was a governing body member shopping for alcohol himself rather than having it delivered discreetly? Why such expensive brands when the organization constantly preaches simplicity and avoiding materialism? Why on a Sunday morning when faithful witnesses were preparing for meetings? But most troubling to many observers was the quantity. This wasn't a single bottle for a quiet evening. This was a significant purchase that suggested either regular heavy consumption or preparation for entertaining on a scale that seemed inconsistent with the modest lifestyle the governing body claims to maintain. Former members of the Watchtower headquarters staff began sharing their own observations. Several anonymous accounts emerged describing Morris's behavior at Bethel, the organization's world headquarters. These accounts, while impossible to verify completely, painted a consistent picture of a man whose alcohol consumption had become an open secret among the inner circle. Stories circulated about Morris needing help walking after evening meals, about bottles being discreetly removed from his room, about increasingly erratic behavior during morning worship sessions. One particularly detailed account came from someone claiming to have worked in the Bethel dining facility, who described regular deliveries of alcohol to Morris's quarters that far exceeded what would be considered normal or moderate by any standard. The implications of this were enormous. If Morris truly had a drinking problem, it meant that the other members of the governing body had been covering for him, possibly for years. It meant that the men who claimed to speak directly for God, who set rules for millions of people worldwide, who disfellowship ordinary members for minor infractions, had been protecting one of their own despite behavior that would get any regular witness disfellowshipped or at minimum removed from serving as an elder. The hypocrisy was staggering. But there's another layer to this theory that makes it even more troubling. Alcohol abuse rarely exists in isolation. It's often a symptom of deeper issues, stress, guilt, or attempts to cope with internal conflict. What was Anthony Morris trying to escape? What pressures or secrets was he trying to numb? For a man who presented such an aggressive, confident facade in his public appearances, the suggestion of private struggle with alcohol hints at a much more complex and troubled individual. Perhaps the weight of maintaining the authoritarian persona, of defending policies he knew were harmful, of enforcing rules that destroyed families, had become too much to bear without chemical assistance. The timing of the liquor store video's emergence is also significant. It appeared online several months before Morris's removal, and while the Watchtower organization ignored it publicly, the damage to Morris's reputation within the organization and among faithful witnesses was immediate and irreparable. Even the most loyal members found it impossible to unsee the image of their supposed spiritual father loading expensive whiskey into his car. The organization's typical response to such scandals is to deny, minimize, and attack the credibility of accusers. But in this case, they couldn't. The video evidence was clear, unambiguous, and impossible to spin. Several former elders have suggested that Morris's drinking had been a concern within the governing body for some time, but the video made it impossible to continue ignoring. The organization operates on appearance and control. As long as problems remain hidden, they can be managed, minimized, swept under the rug. But once something becomes public, once it threatens the organization's carefully constructed image of divine guidance and moral superiority, action becomes necessary. Not because the organization truly cares about helping someone with a drinking problem, but because the scandal threatens their authority and credibility. The silence surrounding Morris's removal suggests that alcohol may have been just one piece of a larger pattern of behavior that the governing body could no longer tolerate or hide. Organizations like the Watchtower don't remove their highest leaders over a single video or isolated incident, especially when that leader has been as prominent and influential as Morris. This suggests that what we saw in that liquor store video was merely the visible tip of a much larger problem, one that had reached a point where Morris had become more of a liability than an asset to the organization's image and control. 2. Internal conflict with the governing body. The second major theory centers on deep internal divisions within the governing body itself, with Morris representing an increasingly problematic conservative faction that was blocking necessary organizational changes. To understand this theory, you need to understand the concept of new light within Jehovah's Witness doctrine. New light is the organization's mechanism for changing teachings, policies, and interpretations without admitting they were wrong before. It's based on a verse in Proverbs about the path of the righteous getting brighter. Essentially, it allows the governing body to reverse course on virtually anything while claiming it's not a reversal at all, but rather progressive revelation from God. In recent years, the Watchtower organization has been implementing numerous significant changes, many of which represent dramatic departures from long-standing positions. They've softened their stance on higher education, modified their blood transfusion policies, adjusted their guidelines on associating with disfellowshipped family members, and made various procedural changes to how judicial committees operate. They've also dramatically shifted their public image, investing heavily in slick video production, creating a more modern and polished online presence, and attempting to appear less extreme and more mainstream to outsiders. These changes haven't come from genuine reform or admission of past mistakes, but from pragmatic necessity. Legal pressures, declining membership in developed countries, financial strains, and the Internet's exposure of their practices have forced adaptation. By all accounts from those familiar with internal governing body dynamics, Anthony Morris III was fundamentally opposed to many of these changes. He represented old-school Watchtower thinking, the kind that saw any concession to modern sensibilities as spiritual weakness and compromise with Satan's world. Comments from former Bethel insiders suggest that Morris frequently clashed with other governing body members over the direction of the organization. He was reportedly vocal in his opposition to softening stances on education, arguing that it would lead members away from pioneering and organizational service. He allegedly fought against modifications to the disfellowshipping policies, seeing them as coddling those who deserved punishment. He was apparently furious about the organization's increasing emphasis on digital media and online presence, viewing it as worldly and spiritually dangerous. One particularly illuminating comment from a former high-level Beth elite suggested that Morris had become bad for business, a telling phrase that reveals how the organization actually thinks about itself. Despite all their claims of seeking spiritual truth regardless of cost, the Watchtower is fundamentally concerned with maintaining and expanding its influence, which requires pragmatic adaptation to changing circumstances. Morris's rigid conservatism was increasingly seen as an obstacle to these necessary adaptations. His inflammatory speeches, his extreme positions, his public controversies were making it harder for the organization to maintain its public image and attract new members. The tight pants controversy is perhaps the most public example of how Morris's views had become problematic for the organization. In one infamous broadcast, he went on an extended rant about how men wearing tight pants were promoting homosexuality, how fashion designers were gay men deliberately trying to make men look attractive to other men, and how any brother wearing such clothing was spiritually weak at best and possibly worse. The speech was so extreme, so bizarre, and so clearly rooted in personal obsession rather than biblical principle that it became an embarrassment even to many faithful witnesses. It was widely mocked online, becoming a symbol of how out of touch and irrational the organization's leadership had become. But that wasn't an isolated incident. Morris regularly made statements in broadcasts and at conventions that the organization later had to walk back or minimize. He would take hardline positions on issues that the other governing body members were trying to soften. He would make declarative statements about doctrine that contradicted the new light others were trying to introduce. For an organization that depends on presenting a unified front of divinely guided leadership, having one member constantly undermining consensus became untenable. Several leaked emails and documents from Bethel suggest that by late 2022, Morris had essentially become isolated within the governing body. Other members were reportedly avoiding working with him on projects, excluding him from certain decisions, and finding ways to minimize his involvement in public broadcasts. This kind of internal division is extraordinarily dangerous for the Watchtower's authority structure. If the governing body can't maintain unity, it undermines their entire claim to divine guidance. How can they be God's chosen channel if they can't even agree among themselves? The situation apparently came to a head over proposed changes to how child sexual abuse cases would be handled. The organization has been facing massive legal and public relations disasters over its policies that protected abusers and silenced victims. Pressure was mounting to make real reforms, not just cosmetic ones. According to several well-connected former members, Morris was adamantly opposed to making any significant changes to the two-witness rule or to policies requiring victims to confront their abusers. He allegedly argued that such changes would be admitting fault and would open the organization to even more lawsuits. Other governing body members, recognizing the catastrophic legal and moral implications of maintaining the status quo, wanted to implement reforms. The conflict became so intense that it paralyzed decision-making on this critical issue. There's also the matter of financial concerns. The Watchtower organization has been facing significant financial pressures, resulting in the sale of numerous properties, reduction in printed materials, consolidation of congregations, and aggressive donation campaigns. These pressures have required the organization to make pragmatic decisions that Morris apparently viewed as spiritually compromising. He reportedly opposed selling kingdom halls and demanding that congregations send their funds to headquarters. He allegedly fought against reducing the number of printed magazines and books. He was apparently against the organization's increasing reliance on digital media at the expense of traditional methods. In his view, these were all concessions to worldly thinking rather than maintaining faith that Jehovah would provide. The breaking point seems to have come when Morris realized he was losing every battle. The other governing body members had formed a consensus that the organization needed to change, needed to adapt, needed to present a softer image to the world. They had decided that survival and growth required compromise on certain long-held positions. Morris, seeing himself as the last defender of true Watchtower principles, apparently refused to go along. But in an organization that demands absolute unity, one dissenting voice at the highest level cannot be tolerated indefinitely. The choice became clear: remove Morris, or risk the entire leadership structure fragmenting. 3. Involvement in sensitive matters and reputational risk. The third theory, and perhaps the most disturbing, suggests that Morris's sudden removal was connected to something far more serious than personal conduct or doctrinal disagreements. This theory proposes that he became entangled, either directly or through association, in investigations related to abuse within the organization, and that his removal was an emergency measure to protect the Watchtower from catastrophic reputational and legal damage. The timing of Morris's removal is particularly significant when examined alongside ongoing legal cases against the organization. In late 2022 and early 2023, multiple jurisdictions were pursuing investigations into the Watchtower's handling of child sexual abuse cases. Court documents were being unsealed that exposed decades of internal organizational policies designed to protect abusers and silence victims. The organization was facing billions in potential legal liability. And increasingly, these cases were focusing not just on local elder bodies, but on the governing body itself and its direct involvement in creating and enforcing policies that enabled abuse. Several people with inside knowledge of the organization's legal troubles have suggested that Morris's name came up in certain depositions and discovery processes. While the specific details remain sealed or confidential, the suggestion is that communications involving Morris revealed either direct knowledge of abuse cases that weren't reported to authorities, or involvement in decisions to protect abusers and punish victims who spoke out. If true, this would make him personally liable in ways that could threaten not just his freedom, but the organization's entire legal strategy of claiming that abuse was handled by autonomous local congregations rather than directed by central authority. There's also the matter of Morris's own past that has raised questions. Some researchers into his background have found inconsistencies and gaps in his biographical narrative that the organization promoted. His military service record has been questioned, with some suggesting that details were embellished or misrepresented to create a more impressive backstory. More troubling are unconfirmed reports that during his time as a circuit overseer, there were complaints about his conduct with female members of congregations, complaints that were allegedly suppressed and never properly investigated. While these reports remain unverified, the pattern of powerful men within the organization having their misconduct covered up is well documented. The speed and manner of Morris's removal suggest crisis management rather than planned transition. Typically, when a governing body member retires or steps down for health reasons, There's a carefully orchestrated announcement that thanks them for their service, often with specific mention of their contributions and ongoing prayers for their well-being. When Theodore Urash died in 2010, the organization issued detailed statements celebrating his life of service. When John Barr retired due to age and health in 2010, there were appreciative acknowledgments. Even when less prominent members have left for various reasons, there's been some form of official recognition. But Morris got nothing. Just a terse statement and immediate erasure. This suggests that whatever led to his removal was something the organization wanted to distance itself from as quickly and completely as possible. They couldn't afford a farewell tribute that might later be embarrassing if more information came to light. They couldn't risk associating his name with gratitude and appreciation if he was about to become a legal or public relations liability. The clean break, the complete erasure, the absolute silence all point to damage control. Shortly after his removal, reports emerged that Morris and his wife had been relocated to a property in North Carolina, a residence reportedly purchased or provided by the organization. This immediately raised suspicions of a severance package or hush money arrangement. Why would the organization, which had just unceremoniously removed him from the highest position of authority, then provide him with comfortable accommodations? The most logical explanation is that they needed to ensure his silence. If Morris had dirt on the organization, if he knew where bodies were buried, if he had information that could be damaging if he decided to go public or cooperate with investigators, then keeping him comfortable and quiet would be worth the expense. The lack of any statement from Morris himself is also telling. He's been completely silent since his removal, making no public appearances, issuing no statements, not even posting on social media if he has any accounts. For a man who spent nearly 2 decades as one of the most visible and vocal members of the governing body, this silence is deafening. It suggests either a legal agreement preventing him from speaking, or fear of what might be revealed if he does. Either possibility points to something serious lurking beneath the surface. Some former members who left the organization after Morris's removal have hinted at knowing more than they can publicly say, suggesting that the full story involves information that is legally protected or that could expose them to liability if disclosed. One former elder who served at headquarters posted cryptically that, when the full truth comes out about why Tony was removed, it will shake the faith of even the most loyal witnesses. Another suggested that Morris's removal was just the first domino, and that more changes in the governing body were coming as the organization tried to insulate itself from growing legal threats. There's also speculation about possible financial impropriety. The Watchtower organization handles billions in assets and donations, with virtually no external oversight or accountability. The governing body members have access to organizational funds and make decisions about asset allocation with no checks or balances. While the organization claims that all funds are used for spiritual purposes, the reality is that governing body members live in extreme comfort at headquarters, travel first class to international conventions, and have access to resources that would scandalize most witnesses if they knew the details. If Morris had been using organizational funds inappropriately, or if his spending was becoming impossible to hide or justify, that alone could warrant immediate removal. The disappearance of Anthony Morris III from the governing body remains one of the greatest recent mysteries within Jehovah's Witnesses. Whether due to personal problems, power struggles, or internal secrets, the fact is that his departure exposed cracks in a structure that has always presented itself as infallible and united. When one of the most influential men is erased without explanation, doubt sets in. What else is being hidden behind the walls of the Watchtower? Perhaps, in the end, the real reason lies less in one man and more in a system that tolerates neither transparency nor weakness. But Morris's removal also reveals something even more fundamental about the nature of the Watchtower organization. For all their claims of divine guidance, of being God's exclusive channel on earth, of having unique access to spiritual truth, they operate exactly like any other human institution facing crisis. They protect their image. They cover up problems. They sacrifice individuals to preserve the system. They lie when necessary. They enforce silence through fear, legal agreements, and financial incentives. None of this is the behavior of an organization guided by God. It's the behavior of an organization guided by lawyers, public relations consultants, and leaders desperately trying to maintain control. The faithful are left with impossible questions. If the governing body is truly appointed by God, how could one of its members be so flawed? If they're receiving divine guidance, why did it take nearly 2 decades to remove someone who was apparently unfit for the position? If they can't be transparent about something as basic as why a leader was removed, how can anyone trust anything else they say? These questions don't have satisfying answers within the Watchtower's theological framework, which is why the organization chose silence over explanation. For those still inside the organization, Morris's removal has had a profound psychological impact even if they can't articulate it. Every time they see the governing body on a broadcast, they notice his absence. Every time they're told to trust these men as God's representatives, they remember that one of these supposedly perfect leaders was quietly discarded like trash. Every time they're lectured about loyalty, obedience, and trust, they wonder what else they're not being told. The cognitive dissonance is powerful, and for many, it's the beginning of awakening to the reality that the organization is not what it claims to be. Morris himself has become a ghost, a non-person in true Orwellian fashion. For someone who was so prominent for so long, his erasure is chillingly complete. New witnesses coming into the organization today will never know he existed unless they dig into the internet's archived content. Videos he appeared in have been deleted or edited to remove him. Publications have been revised. His name is spoken only in whispers among those who remember. This is how the organization handles inconvenient truths, by pretending they never existed. But the internet remembers. Former members remember. And the questions persist. What really happened to Anthony Morris III? Was he removed for one reason, or multiple reasons that all converged at once? Will we ever know the full truth? Probably not from the organization itself, which has demonstrated that it will take its secrets to the grave rather than risk honest transparency. But perhaps that's the most important revelation of all. An organization that claims to represent truth is built on a foundation of secrets, silence, and carefully managed information. And when that foundation begins to crack, when people start asking questions that can't be satisfactorily answered, the entire edifice of authority begins to crumble. Morris's removal may have been intended to protect the organization, but instead, it became one more piece of evidence that the Watchtower is exactly what critics have always said it is, a high-control group run by fallible men who will do whatever necessary to maintain power, even if it means betraying their own stated principles and abandoning their own leaders when convenient.